questions in groups of 2 or 3. I'll try and get through as many as we can. Just start with this lady in the... Yeah, yourself.
My name's Anne. Andy, it did seem to me that you left one thing out of your talk, and that was the question of climate change, and also the question of the ecosystem's capacity to churn out the amount of steel or all the materials that we need for machines. You know, the stuff we put inside our iPhones comes from the Congo, and there's a limited amount of it. Don't you think that you should take that into account? That actually, if we do face climate change, we may have to transform our economy away from carbon and towards something that is a more labour-intensive economy.
And can we also take Pete just straight to this gentleman here?
Andy, you seem to treat, as Francis said, the technological change is something inevitable that only goes in one direction and only has a very narrow path. But much of the technical change you're talking about would occur in what is now in the public sector, and I hope it stays in the public sector. And that becomes much more of a policy choice and a question of how you define quality. So it seems to me that you put forward one possibility, but it's more a possibility which would occur within the private sector, not the public sector.
And can we have one just in the row behind, please? Yes, there we go.
Hello, Peter Spence, Telegraph. You talked about how robots might replace economic forecasters. Milton Friedman often said that he'd rather that computers or robots would replace the central bank. When, Andy, will you be arguing that the MPC itself is obsolete and perhaps robots will in the future take over in setting interest rates?
Thank you. We'll take those 3, then we'll move somewhere else in the room. So I'm going to start with, so when are you going to be abolished by a computer, Andy?
Those are not questions for Francis, by the way. Shall I start with the third one? Well, I mean, there has been a version of your debate actually underway in the United States, which is less about delegating responsibility to a robot, but rather delegating responsibility to a rule, an algorithm, if you like, for how policy should be set. That's an active debate within parts of government within the United States. And I think if I had confidence that there was a rule, or indeed a robot, or even a rule-wielding robot, that was capable of doing a better job than me, I would happily, retire tomorrow. But actually, we know quite a lot about the rules that I mentioned and how they might perform. And the truth is, at times of real change, they tend, like the robots, sometimes to underperform and to give a bum steer on the right course of policy. Or put differently, there is still a role, as I hope I said, for judgment, for creativity, for thinking about alternative scenarios that might not have been captured in the past, that aren't well captured by history. And on that, I hope that humans still have a big role to play. Certainly all the evidence I've seen would suggest we're a long way short from having anything rule-like or algorithm-like or robot-like that would not run the risk of making catastrophic errors at just the point you most need them to do the right thing. The rule being debated in the US would not have done anything like as much to loosen monetary policy after the Great Crash as happened. Would that have been a better world? Indeed, I'd throw into the pot the third sector, actually, often forgotten, the voluntary sector, which too could, and in some cases is, making much greater and better use of technology to help to do their job even more effectively. So it wasn't meant to be just a private sector story. And Anne, on climate change, so as you know, my boss, Mark, gave a speech on climate change, which seemed to divide opinion somewhat a few weeks ago. I mean, he was very careful to focus that squarely on the way in which climate change may ricochet back to the things that we do, which is keeping the financial system safe and keeping the economy on track. Your question, which is a very important one, is certainly well above my pay grade. So I might just duck it for now, and we can discuss it over the craft beer afterwards.
Or two.
Or two.
If you don't want to duck the climate change question, Francis.
Well, I'm kind of disappointed that you haven't shared the idea that I think came up through the open forum or elsewhere, that maybe in trade union terms, maybe on interest rates we should be running consultative ballots, which I think could provide some interesting guidance to you. But I think on both the technology and the climate change question, which are obviously very closely linked, as we know, there are real jobs and skills opportunities as well as risks. But I think, as Anne will be familiar, a big kind of concern for the trade union movement is how we manage that transition in a way that provides good jobs and skills for people, and that it doesn't just have to be a case of we're closing you down, but go along and pay to get yourself skilled, or take out a loan nowadays to get yourself skilled up and somehow find another job. We could manage and plan all of this much better if we saw it as a national priority and something in which everybody could have a voice. We do it sometimes when we're in trouble, but we don't do it as a matter of course. And there are massive opportunities to introduce technology or to make the changes we need to, adapting workplaces in respect of climate change, without all of that risk necessarily going on the backs of workers or their wages. Sometimes I think Luddites got a really bad press, in terms of history, in that actually they weren't against mechanisation. No. They were about protecting their jobs and pay. They recognised change was necessary, but they weren't prepared to pay the price all by themselves.
Thank you. Move towards this side. We can take the lady just here, please.
Thanks very much. My name's Jess Northend. I work for the John Lewis Partnership. My business is wholly owned by its employees, and in other words, that means labour employs capital instead of vice versa. Yeah. And there's actually an increasing number of businesses that are taking our model in the economy. So I'd just be grateful for both of your thoughts about whether having more businesses with our type of model could make some difference to the type of picture that you've presented this evening.
And the gentleman next to her.
Yeah, Bernard Casey from London School of Economics. I wanted to come back to the P word, productivity, because it was in lots of diagrams that Andy produced, but Francis made much reference to it too. It is a ratio. There is a denominator and a numerator. The denominator might be people, as it was in one of the pictures, but it might be hours, and certainly 0 hours contracts, but also part-time working play is a considerable determinant in what productivity as we see it might be. But the numerator, which is something I do not yet understand at all, particularly in a service-oriented economy, which we have seen it is, and particularly in an economy where things like financial services are very dominant as well. Do we actually really know what this thing called productivity is, and do we know where it is going?
And this gentleman at the very front, please.
Thanks. Rod Dowler from the Industry Forum. I mean, it seems to me that humans only compete with robots on the supply side of the economy. So far, we still control the demand side of the economy, and humans have actually shown an infinite capacity for thinking up of new things to do. And so I suggest, actually, that there'll be lots of jobs in the future that we can't even envisage now. I mean, I never thought of people being an SEO analyst or a search marketeer or a social media marketeer, 10 or 20 years ago. So those things will happen. And there is an enormous shortage of supply of people in the care industry. Yeah. You can't get any talking therapies now. You only get drugs. You know, if you, in most cases, in mental illness, you know, looking after old people and looking after kids can't really be delegated very safely to machines. So I suggest there's a lot to be done in looking at the future shape of the economy. And then I think it will just be ideology, actually, how the wage pie is split, you know, between the workers and the suppliers of capital.
I think you should take some answers to those.
Me first. So on the third, I rather agree with you, actually. I think that is, and the point, one of the reasons for raising it tonight was we should think about that. We should think about this rather than letting it happen to us. Which goes to Francis's point about thinking about skills and vocational training. What would we need of the new generation to fit the new demands of the economy? So I couldn't agree more. On productivity, yes. I mean, both numerator and denominator are measured imperfectly and divide one imperfect thing by another imperfect thing. It's probably not perfect. And we have looked very carefully about how much of the puzzle, the productivity puzzle that Francis referred to, the flatlining, is a pure measurement thing. I mean, the truth is you can't know. If we knew it was that, we'd be able to do something about it. We suspect it's some, but by no means all. It's true enough that measuring the output of an economy that isn't widgets, but is doing stuff for other people, is somewhat harder, especially so when it's virtual stuff rather than physical stuff. So that is making the task of our Office for National Statistics harder. They are putting a lot more effort into trying to get a handle on the parts that are currently foggy. Financial services is plainly one of those. And at best, what we're doing there is indirect and imperfect. So is it part of the puzzle? Yes. As best we can tell, it is not the lion's share of the puzzle. That is real, not statistical. We reckon of the, Francis mentioned 17%, let's call it, somewhere in that ballpark. I reckon 3 or 4 max would be a measurement issue. The rest is real. And finally, on corporate governance, which Duncan and I had a very interesting conversation about a few months ago now. And actually, the part of I didn't talk about in here, which I was planning to. I do think there is something, as I said to Duncan, worth thinking through on the broader corporate governance side. I drew this sharp distinction between capital and labour, or in the words I used, between those who own the robots and those who work for the robots, looking forward futuristically. There is no reason why there should be a sharp line between those things. You can have one and the same entity both owning and working. And in essence, John Lewis or other mutuals are cut from precisely that cloth. Could that make, in future, for an even better way of making things work? I think that's worth thinking through and taking seriously. It bears directly upon the stuff that Francis said about ensuring that all stakeholders in a company, including workers, but not just including workers, customers and clients as well, have a say at the table when it comes to the running of a company. It is the misnomer to end all misnomers to think that the owners, the only owners of a public company, are its shareholders, as John Kay's piece in the FT makes clear. So should we think imaginatively about different models? Yes. Could that make a difference to the fortunes of investment in the economy? Yes. Has there been a better time to start thinking about this? No.
I mean, I'd just add to that. I think the issue of ownership is incredibly important, and the need for different models of ownership is pressing, not least because we lost so many of those alternative organisations like mutuals, and because we've seen this concentration and globalisation of capital. And certainly, you know, in the average company now, most shares in Britain are held overseas. They're only held for a matter of months at most, you know, and hence, as others have documented, that real danger of such a disconnect opening up between those who own a company and those whose livelihoods or consumer services or whatever it might be depends on it, communities. So I think corporate governance really is due an overhaul, and it's an urgent area if we want to see a healthier economy. Although, just from a trade union point of view, I think we also need to get to grips with, as many of our unions already do, but what's happening with, particularly in areas like creative industries where you have large numbers of self-employed, freelance, temporary workers, and the degree to which they're self-organising in a very interesting way. In many ways, for me, the new unions of the future that we as a if you like, the official trade union movement needs to kind of think about how we harness that energy and provide a voice for that growing number of workers in the economy.
Perfect. Well, we'll take one more round of questions. I'm going to take the gentleman just in the middle here, please. Just this one here, please.
Colin Hines, the Green New Deal Group. It's not just face-to-face and hair caring, which is a robot-free zone. It's also infrastructural renewal. And going back to Anne Pettifor's point about the importance of climate change, we're in the process of printing €7 trillion euros worth of QE. And the Green New Deal Group proposed a green quantitative easing programme that could not only generate work in every constituency in the country, but could actually tackle climate change. And so I wondered, Andy, what your view was on a more imaginative and environmental use of quantitative easing.
The gentleman behind it, I'm sure Andy thought he was going to get away without the aspect of quantitative easing, but the gentleman straight behind, please. Yes, thank you. And then there's a lady at the front.
Yeah, Rodney Bigstep, really very much on this. I really wanted Andy's views about the suggestion about investment bank and the like. What is it, 750 billion sitting in the hands of corporate interests, which could have been invested, you know, contrary to everything that was said. Loads of money, but not going into jobs. And these are the people that talk about us being unpatriotic, you know. Absolutely ridiculous. And final point is the steel industry is important. Someday we're going to need pitchforks and sledgehammers. Thanks very much.
That's a lady at the very front here.
Thank you very much. Nalini Vittal, University College London. As someone who teaches economics and as a trade unionist, I was hoping you'd say something nice from either point of view through this evening. I've been listening in consternation to everything that you've said. Thank you for an excellent lecture. All this about wages, what's happening to the relation with productivity, this overcrowding at the bottom, the median is way below the mean, all this kind of thing. The relation between that and costs, the relation between this and inflation, undershooting the target and things. When all this is known, if you've told this to us, it means that this isn't some kind of secret you've suddenly, you know, divulged to us today or something. Why was the government so irresponsible as to bring in this anti-trade union legislation? You're talking about emotional IQ and everything. If you look at the text of that, the thing is just dripping with hatred, not just for trade unions, but for labor, it seems to me. And I think it's going to redefine not just the relationship between management and labor, but between state and society, as far as I'm concerned. I would like your opinion on that. Though I know you're an economist, I would like to know, because this is actually an economics question. How does it make economic sense? I want to know, first of all. From EQ, perhaps we can go to QE. Do you think you could please tell us something about the people's QE? Is there any mileage in it? Thank you.
Okay, well, I think it's the last round of questions, and I'm going to just abuse my chair's privilege as well. So if we I'll throw in a question as well, and if you could answer, maybe sum up, and then we can finish on Francis. Just because you did mention what you didn't have time to say in your remarks was the role of redistribution in all of this. So I'm afraid I'm giving you an option of redistribution, people's quantitative easing, or the trade union bill to pick from.
Wow, that's quite a choice, Duncan. I thank you for it. So actually on redistribution, it was the capital labour redistribution, and I've covered that off through the corporate governance thing anyway, actually. Listen, all I'd say on, I might pass the workers' rights legislation question to Francis, but on QE and the various manifestations, I mean, all I would say is this, and Francis made this point very clearly and compellingly for me. There is a perfectly cogent and coherent argument for wanting to do more on the infrastructure side. And that was very well set out by Francis tonight, and if you lined up a dozen economists, I'm sure some of them at least, probably a majority of them, might make the case as well. It is the case that most governments around the world right now can borrow for 50 years in inflation-adjusted terms for diddly squat, for nothing, for free. So I think I'm safe in saying there has not been a better time to borrow than now in pure cost terms. In fact, I know that to be true. It's over a year ago now, I was appearing before a Treasury Select Committee, and in a moment of exaggeration, actually, said that I thought interest rates were at their lowest levels ever. Now, ever is a long time. And at that point, I hadn't actually checked that fact for sure. But having since checked that fact, I can tell you with some confidence that interest rates are at their lowest levels at least since Babylonian times. So for 5,000 years. And I say all of that because I think it would be useful to separate out the questions of appropriate levels of infrastructure spend, which are a fiscal issue, from the monetary issue of how to finance it. You know.
Exactly.
And in some ways, I think if you did that, the debate would be easier to have than the way it's being conducted right now.
I'd agree with that.
And do we have time for? I'm just looking at my. Okay, we're going to take one more gentleman at the front here.
All your figures are before housing costs, and I'm just wondering what sort of hope you could hold out for the 58% of households in Haringey Borough who are renters, the 47% who are renters in London, and the 33% in England. They have suffered ever-increasing rents, which are really undoing much of the purpose of the living wage. The purpose of the living wage, because I commissioned the research for the first London living wage, was to have it somehow or other linked annually to the cost of food, clothes, transport, and other necessities. Yeah. But more and more and more, because of the chaotic housing market and the world economy buying London property, the rents are going up and destroying the purpose of the living wage by taking more of the income needed for food. If, on the other hand, you own your own home in 2008, you have seen the value of your property go up quite enormously because of the money is being allowed to flood in to a housing market in short supply. At the very heart of the British economy, there is that colossal injustice, and what does the bank propose to do about it?
So it's a fantastic question, and I think your diagnosis is spot on. It should have come as a secret to no one. I don't think anyone is actually in denial that the UK housing market is broken, and why it's broken is not difficult to diagnose. we know with a pretty high degree of certainty relative to most of our forecasts how many houses we need to build to meet the needs of households. And since the Second World War, that's been around 200,000. Now, for pretty much every year after the Second World War, up until the early 1970s, that's the number we built. And in pretty much every year since, we've built around half that number. So there is a chronic and accumulated imbalance between demand and supply, and it's that that's sending skyward, has sent skyward house prices.
But even if we build and the Chinese buy everything, the rents are going to be sky high.
Well, I don't know about all I would say is that at the root of this is something very basic, which is a lack of house building, a lack of housing supply, both for the rental market and for the private market. If you go back to why it was, we as a country started building half as many houses as we needed in the 1970s, there's a very, very simple explanation. We stopped building council houses. That's why the gap opened up, and that's why the gap exists. Private house building has been pretty much the same, pretty steady, give or take, since the Second World War. And what could we at the Bank of England do? Well, unfortunately, at least not yet, we don't build houses yet. We're long economists and short bricklayers.
There are land banks, which you might be able to do something about.
Well, but this isn't, I think, an issue of financing. I think mortgage rates have never been lower in this country. If anything, the risk is that housing demand gets too far ahead of supply, which is why prices pick up too rapidly. We at the bank can, and indeed are, and should, try and ensure that the demand for housing doesn't get too far out of whack. And that we are now doing. But ultimately, if we are to crack this nut, which is one of the biggest we as a country face, the solution has to lie on the supply of housing, on house building, rather than on.
Thank you. I mean, if we were in the Newsman studio now, there'd be a voice in my ear shouting, you're over, wrap it up. It's a voice I know well. But I'm sure this debate can continue. There will be drinks through in the next room. I just want to say a huge thank you to Francis for hosting, a huge thank you to Andy for coming, and thank you to all of you for coming along. Thank you very much.